Hi guys, thank you for tuning into my first true crime video. My name is Adam Farrow and today we're going to be covering a case about a guy called Anatoly Moskvin. A quick warning before we do start, there will be some photos used in the video of the crime scene. Some people may find these disturbing, and a trigger warning about the photos. They will include the bodies of girls which have been transformed into magical dolls. So we've just got to get that out of the way in case anybody doesn't want to watch the video on the basis of that. So as I said, the case is about a guy called Anatoly Moskvin. I always like to start at the beginning and try to delve into the childhoods of the people that we'd be discussing in the cases. And we often find that childhood events and trauma may play a part in what people do in later life. So people who have committed crimes, they may not have had the best upbringing, or they may have been subject to different traumas. So without further ado, Anatoly Moskvin was born on the 1st of September 1966 to parents Elvira and Yuri. He was born and raised in Nizhny Novgorod, which is a large city in western Russia. He was an introverted child, but he always loved academia and writing stories. As a young one, he was an avid stamp collector, and he did have many different hobbies. However, he didn't have hobbies which would involve others. So he was often alone and he was quiet and introverted. During his school life, he was bullied on the playground and he was bullied consistently throughout his childhood. It had been noted, however, that if the children did go on field trips to local farms, the children would often be fighting to sit with Anatoly because of the level of intelligence that he possessed. He was self-taught in different languages, and for example on the field trips to the local farms, he would have a vast knowledge of different plants, including their Latin names and all of their properties. But on the schoolyard, it was different. People didn't want to associate with him. He was introverted, and the other children found him to be a bit weird and quiet, and he didn't fit in. When he was a very young child, Anatoly suffered a traumatic experience. At the young age of 7 years old, he was walking home from school one day when he was brutally assaulted and raped by a man. I mean, that must have been absolutely horrific. I can't imagine how horrible that would be for somebody so young. It is a crime that people don't recover from at any age, but for it to happen at 7 years old, I can't even begin to imagine how much it would have affected that young boy. From that point onwards, he did struggle socially and he became more introverted, which is understandable. Anatoly never spoke about this until he was in his 50s. So he harboured this secret for over 40 years, and it's obviously affected him growing up, as it would with anybody. His parents were never told, and they never had any troubles with him as a child. They knew he was quiet, but he caused no problems. They did know that he struggled socially, but they were unaware that this was likely induced by the trauma that he suffered. Although many reports describe him as socially awkward and introverted, he did have a real passion for learning. And Anatoly would grow into a very, very clever man. He was very academic and he became a professor in later life. On the 4th of March 1979, when he was only 12 years old, a second significant event took place in Anatoly's life. So this was another trauma that he suffered, but it would play a huge role in what he would do in later life. For a bit of background story, there was a government initiative taking place in Soviet Russia where children in their classes would collect paper and card from the streets to be recycled. This was a way of cleaning up the streets, but it was also incentivised as the classes were in a competition to see which class could collect the most. Anatoly, when taking part in this task, seen that there was a yard with people in it, dressed in long robes, holding candles and singing in a foreign language. But at the back of the yard, he'd noticed that there was a lot of discarded card. He thought that if he could trespass into the yard, he could gather all this and it'd make his classmates happy. Because Anatoly was just a young boy, he did want to be accepted. He'd previously suffered the trauma, but he didn't want to always be alone, introverted, shy and quiet. He wanted to be accepted into the larger group. So he trespassed onto the land, but he was seen by one of the adults who grabbed Anatoly and took him to the rest of the adults who were stood over an open casket and singing in a foreign language. In the casket was the body of a young girl called Natasha Petrova. She had tragically passed away in childhood. She was having a bath when she reached for a towel and instead grabbed hold of an electrical cable, and her life was tragically taken away at just the tender age of 11 years old. So Anatoly was greeted in the casket by an 11-year-old girl who tragically died, And this must be hard because at that age you're only ever used to knowing of normally old people who pass away. But to see somebody your age, it must have been harrowing for him. The parents of Natasha insisted that Anatoly kissed her. This was maybe a custom in their culture, or possibly a superstition. There are a number of different reports on this, and they do vary on how many times he kissed Natasha, but it has been suggested in multiple reports that he kissed her 3 times. Twice he was forced to against his will, but the 3rd time he wanted to because he'd realised that he liked it. Anatoly was given 2 rings, one for his and one for Natasha's wedding finger. At the young age of 12 years old, after suffering previous trauma, Anatoly seems to have been part of some sort of posthumous marriage. Maybe the parents dragged Anatoly in because he was seen as an act of God, or that he was fated because he just so happened to have been in the yard at the time that they were mourning their daughter's life before the funeral procession. A posthumous marriage religiously brings a moral satisfaction, and it is believed that married spirits can be intertwined, and it is also believed that you will not be alone if you're married. After Anatoly was forced to kiss Natasha and place a ring on her finger, he was given an apple and money, and he was instructed that he mustn't tell anybody for 40 days. So although we're not sure what religion that the family of Natasha followed, we do know that 40 is a number often used as a mourning period in religious practices. For example, in the Bible, 40 is used in times which are testing, trial times, and then when there's finally triumph. And the number 40 in these instances is mentioned 157 times in the Bible scriptures. So it's certainly a religious number and one which may be used in superstitions. One thing I think we've got to consider here. So Anatoly has been through his previous trauma when he was assaulted at 7 years old, and then he's finally building up the courage to try and be part of the group, be part of the friends group at school. He wanted to gather the card so they'd be happy with him. He could be accepted into a normal childhood, which was something that he hadn't experienced. This was taken away from him when he was a young child, and the second time he tries to be involved with people, he's then dragged into this posthumous marriage. He's forced to kiss a girl in a casket who died. It must be really, really hard to deal with. And the following events that happened obviously show and highlight the trauma that this played in Anatoly's life. So after Anatoly had left the funeral procession, he then went and spent the money on a book about animals. We do know that Anatoly loved learning, so this isn't surprising. But following on from this, Anatoly started having lots of night terrors and lots of nighttime visions about Natasha. He said that she would visit him every night in his dreams. So every single night that he fell asleep, all he would see is Natasha, and he said that she came to him and told him that he must learn black magic. He refused to embrace this and he refused to acknowledge it, but the dreams wouldn't stop. So he was so scared and he visited Natasha's village. The dreams did stop for a short while, but they soon returned. Anatoly was very, very troubled about this, and he told his parents. This must have deeply affected him because normally Anatoly would hold on to things and not tell anybody. He never mentioned the assault he endured at 7 until he was in his 50s, but he did reach out about these visions. Anatoly's parents sought medical advice. They went and took him to a child psychologist, but nothing came of it. The psychologist blamed this on puberty and provided his parents with valerian root, which is a plant used to reduce anxiety and promote better sleep. So his parents were giving him this medicine, but it didn't take away from the night traumas and night visions. These visits from Natasha lasted a whole year, and he'd been told night after night that he must learn black magic. He started looking into this because he wanted the visions to stop. With Anatoly being very well read, he was taking a little interest in black magic and learned that there was a spell he could do in order to stop the dreams from happening and to pass these night terrors onto somebody else, so the visions were no longer there for him. So he read that if he got hold of somebody else's tooth, performed a spell and placed it under his pillar, the night terrors would be passed on to somebody else. We're not quite sure how it happened, but Anatoly said that when he was younger he did manage to get hold of one of his classmates' teeth. He did perform a spell on this and placed it under his pillow. After performing this black magic spell, Anatoly said that the dreams did stop and he was no longer receiving visits from Natasha in his dreams. However, when the dreams stopped and when the night terrors stopped, he suddenly developed a keen interest in cemeteries, death and the occult, and pretty much all dark practices. Such was Anatoly's obsession with the dead and the world beyond the grave. He would read and study in cemeteries alone. He really enjoyed the peace of the cemetery, and he would long to go there whenever he could. It has been said that he would try to visit them every single day. So Anatoly had become more withdrawn. He was spending a lot of time in cemeteries. He had tried to integrate with the other children, then he suffered this second traumatic event. So he started being alone more, and he was studying and researching and reading in cemeteries. After he'd finished school, he decided to continue in education, and he studied at the Philological Faculty of Moscow State University. At this point in time, he could speak 13 languages fluently, and all of which were self-taught, so he was a very, very clever man. At university, he joined a Luciferian society, and as part of joining the Luciferian society, he made a promise of celibacy, not to smoke and not to drink alcohol for the rest of his days. He had to pass a test doing this to be accepted into the society. Although Anatoly passed the test using black magic on animals and was accepted, he still remained a loner and he was still introverted. We do, however, know there's lots of reports that he was listed as a genius. He produced 4 dictionaries where he would translate them from Russian to English and English back to Russian. He'd written an array of books and articles, but he was always described as difficult to get along with. One of the articles that I've read, it was noted that in 2003, Anatoly met Julia Grinova, who he entered into a relationship with. So this time in his life, he wasn't alone. She wanted children with him, and he did too. However, he had sworn a life of celibacy when he joined his Luciferian society, and as a result, they did not have a sexual relationship. It is still believed that Anatoly is a virgin today. Both him and Julia were happy with companionship, and they chose to try to adopt a child. Anatoly was always passionate about having a child, and he always wanted a daughter to look after. Unfortunately, the adoption failed on the grounds that Anatoly would not be able to provide financially, as he was not in regular work. He did hold a variety of academic positions, but he did this on an ad hoc basis. He lived with his parents and he had no stable income other than the odd bit of tutoring that he would do if he would do a lecture at a university or some of the articles that he would get published, but he didn't have a regular job or a home of his own. As a result of this, his relationship with Julia broke down. This relationship breaking down seems to be the third event in Anatoly's life that shaped the future to come for him. It denied him the chance to adopt a child, and it seemed to impact his behaviour, and he became even more isolated, and there was not many people going forward that Anatoly did speak to. When his relationship broke down, this was more reason for Anatoly to pursue his love of the occult and a desire to get in touch with the dead. So we know this stemmed from his childhood encounter with Natasha, but he wanted to revisit these feelings because he was regretting that he didn't accept the night visits, he didn't accept the night terrors, and he was too scared, so he tried to get rid of these with the previous spell that he did. One thing that I'd like to touch on in greater detail, as I've not seen it in many of the articles about Anatoly, was his involvement in the Luciferian society and the occult views that shaped Anatoly's behaviour. So the Luciferian society is something he was very serious about, and it played a huge part in his life. It was one of many jigsaw pieces that turned Moskvin into a man being obsessed with the dead, and the dead being used as magic dolls. He felt that with the help of these spirits, he was able to access worlds beyond the grave. So it's clear that Anatoly wasn't fitting in life normally. He didn't have friends, he didn't have any acquaintances, but he wanted to be friends with people who weren't here anymore. He wanted to have an impact on life beyond this realm. Luciferian societies often have dark occultist beliefs, and this hidden dark knowledge is strictly kept in these circles and societies. When analysing Moskvin's beliefs, it seems that he's combined syncretic paganism with Gnostic Luciferianism. We know his communion with the spirits of the dead came in his childhood, when he was made to kiss Natasha and place a ring on both hers and his wedding fingers. So in his eyes, he's married, and this might have been part of the reason that he chose the life of celibacy. It is such a traumatic thing that he had to experience at 12 years old, and that might be why he chose the celibacy route. The night visits that he had obviously played a key role in him joining the Luciferian society, because he wanted to have more dealings with the afterlife and the dead, as he had previously blocked out these dreams or visions he was having at night. So he'd suffered a lot of trauma throughout his younger life and felt scared. He felt that there was a chance missed to communicate with Natasha, but now he's got his chance in the Luciferian society and he was definitely going to embrace this. Anatoly is a very intelligent man. He'd studied various pagan traditions such as the Mari, the Yakuts and the Celts. He was also an expert in Celtology and he was a professor as well. He absorbed their views and he shared their views of the afterlife. He, like them, believed that he could contact the world you visit beyond the grave by the help of rituals, spirits and magic dolls. In order to make the dolls magic, you would place something of the original host inside the dolls. This could be something as simple as a tuft of hair, and this is something we'll touch on a little bit later on in the video. In shamanic practices, magical dolls are a means of travel between the two worlds. Although Anatoly followed some pagan ideologies, he was strictly adherent to his Luciferianism. Luciferianism has a number of different variants, but all forms of this encompass three main values, which are freedom, knowledge and power. The freedom is the freedom from the restraints of materialism, the knowledge is access to forbidden knowledge, and the power is the power of oneself as the highest form of power. Like with every religious practice, there can be different interpretations, and you also do get some people who hold and harbour more extreme ideologies. We also know as well that Moskvin practiced a dark occult version of Luciferianism. Occult practices of this kind focus heavily on the spirits of the dead. He would become obsessed with the dead, and over time he dug up the bodies of 26 girls who he mummified to preserve them and lived with them in his flat, which he shared with his mother and his father. So that in itself, like the fact that he lived in a small flat with his mother and father, is astonishing that they didn't know what was happening. In July 2005, he was employed by Oleg Ryabov, who was a well-known historian at the time, and he hired Anatoly to travel around different cemeteries, uncovering the lives and records of lost people. At this point, Moskvin was already actively digging up the girls and turning them into dolls. This just gave him the excuse to spend more time in cemeteries. When he was mummifying the dead girls, he would dig them up and bury them in a shallow grave in a shadowy, less seen area of the graveyard. After Anatoly had dug up a girl, every few days he would visit them in their shallow grave and coat their body in a solution made from bacon, solder and salt, which would dry out the corpses before he transported them back to his and his parents' apartments. The girls that he dug up were predominantly aged between 3 and 12 years old, but there was one girl who was 25 years old. And Moskvin later advised that he was waiting for science to advance to bring his 26 dolls back to life, but the whole idea of resurrection is specifically tied to the occultist form of Luciferianism that he practiced. He mummified the girls and created wax masks for their faces. This was to preserve them, and also that so he could apply makeup to them. In his eyes, he would make them pretty again. Anatoly held this position for 3 years, where he was researching different cemeteries and uncovering the lives of the dead. He would often walk up to 30 kilometers per day, scouting different cemeteries and searching for different graves that he wanted to exhume. Another of Anatoly's passions was reading. He owned over 60,000 books and he would read every day whilst walking. He once said that his feet walked on the roads whilst his eyes walked on the lines of the book. As part of Anatoly's job, he would note all gravestone information. We know, however, that he was also doing this for himself to aid in choosing which of the graves he was to exhume. At times he would sleep rough in the cemeteries, and he would often sleep on top of the graves of girls. More often than not, these would be the graves of young children. As he was an expert on Celtic culture and Celtology, and he also followed paganism, he will have been aware of the ancient Druid practice of sleeping on top of a grave in order to communicate with the spirits of the dead. Police did occasionally question Anatoly because he was found sleeping a number of times on top of graves. However, he was researching for Oleg Ryabov at the time, who was a well-known historian. He was able to show his passport, his research credentials, and his notes, so he would be believed. The real motive, however, was to communicate with the spirits of the dead and help him decide which of the girls he was going to dig up and mummify. There's many reports of Anatoly sleeping in a Muslim cemetery in a coffin that was being prepared. The gravediggers found him asleep the next day, but he was able to talk them out of it before they called the police. By the time 2007 came round, Anatoly was more introverted. He was spending more time in graveyards. He would often drink from the puddles. He would say that this would be so he could be more at one with the spirits, as this water would also seep into the ground where they were buried, and he wanted to feel more at one with the people buried under the soil. In the 3 years that he was working for the historian, he visited over 752 cemeteries, uncovering the lives of over 1,000 lost people. During this time, he continued writing books and wrote articles for various papers. He started being monitored, however, after he wrote a book in 2008. He'd written a book about the history of the swastika, but lots of articles, and in this book as well, he did show fascist ideologies and fascist beliefs. So these fascist thoughts and fascist ideologies placed him on the radar of the police. In 2011, there was a bombing at Domodedovo airport in Russia. Anatoly, after this, had started desecrating Muslim graves. He was painting them, he was pinning articles to them, and he was showing a complete disrespect. So with the piece that he'd written about the swastika history, with the different articles where he'd shown his fascist beliefs in the local papers, Anatoly was investigated to see if it was him that was desecrating these graves in Nizhny Novgorod. And on the 2nd of November 2011, the police raided Anatoly's home. They were concerned about extremism as he was being watched on the account of his fascist ideologies. Rather than finding evidence of this nature, the police found 26 human-sized dolls in Anatoly's home. Initially, they didn't think this was anything to worry about. It didn't look like this was the corpses of 26 young girls. As they were moving the dolls around, they would hear things rattling in them. So although they were looking for evidence that he'd been desecrating graves or evidence of his fascist ideologies, they instead found things rattling in these dolls. So the dolls were opened up, and that's when they started finding the remains of humans. They knew that this was human bones. They would also find inside the dolls things that had been buried with these children. So whether it be like stuffed teddies, toys, jewellery, they would find that in there as well. So at this point in time, they knew that it was much more serious than what they'd originally investigated him for.
Russian police have released this video they shot in what can be described as a house of horrors. They say those aren't dolls strewn about the apartment, but actual remains of people a historian had dug up and dressed in women's clothing and then put on display. They were dressed in bright dresses and headscarves, their hands and faces wrapped in what appears to be cloth.
So Anatoly was being questioned in the police station, and this took a dark turn when they realised that these weren't dolls but were the bodies of 26 different girls. Moskvin, however, did not see this as 26 cadavers, but he seen this as 26 magical dolls that he'd created to speak to them in the afterlife and to help him connect with the world beyond the grave. He also admitted that he was waiting for science to advance to a point where they could bring a body back to life, and he'd rescued these 26 souls. So he seen that he was doing a good thing. So this shows that Anatoly thought he was doing the right thing. He felt like he was rescuing people, although he was desecrating the graves of young children. He was taking them from their final resting place whilst their parents were suffering, and their parents, on the most part, didn't even know that their child was missing. When Anatoly was charged, he left the police with a chilling message. He said, "Do not rebury the girls too deeply, because I will gather them again when I'm free." And this shows that it's a man that doesn't feel like he's done anything wrong, and is showing that he probably will re-offend again. So that's very, very disturbing. What we can tell you about the bodies is he dressed these dead children that he took back to his apartment. He would dress them in stockings, girls' clothing, knee-length boots, and he would try and make them look like dolls. He would even apply lipstick and makeup to their faces, and he put music boxes and personal belongings inside their rib cages. Anatoly marked each of the girls' birthdays and celebrated it with each of the 26 bodies in his apartment. Also, other special occasions were also celebrated. One thing I would like to cover is the psychological damage that is caused to the victims' parents. This has never been acknowledged by Anatoly, who, during his court case, when he was sentenced to 5 years in the psychiatric facility, he said that you abandoned your girls in the cold and I brought them home and warmed them up. One of the most harrowing reports of psychological suffering endured by the parents of the victims was that of Natalia Chardimova. Her daughter was the first of the 26 bodies that Anatoly secretly dug up and dressed as a doll and placed in his parents' apartment. Natalia's daughter was called Olga, and she'd been horrifically murdered aged 10 years old. It was in October 2002, and she'd asked to see if she could walk alone to her grandmother's apartment in the next block. It's the first time she'd ever been out alone. She'd picked her favourite clothes to wear. It was literally a couple of minutes walk, but she never ever left her apartment. She was picked up in the foyer of the apartment, took to the rooftop by somebody who was high on drugs. They mugged her and hit her over the bed with an iron bar, and her parents never ever found her again until 5 months later, when a janitor had visited the rooftop to check some pipe work. He'd found that her body had been left there. So it took 5 months for Olga's parents to receive the body and to give her a burying place. But in October 2012, they would have to relive all of this again. She would be present with the police when they dug Olga's grave up to find that her coffin was empty with a hole in the top of it, which Anatoly had used to drag Olga's body out of. So he would only ever cut a hole in the top of the coffin, and he would drag the children out by the head. Natalia was distraught and was quoted as saying, "You can't begin to imagine that somebody would touch the grave of your child, the most holy place in the world for you. We had been visiting the grave of our child for 9 years, but we had no idea it was empty. Instead, she was in this beast's apartment." I mean, listening to that quote, you can't begin to imagine what the parents are going through. A grave, for a lot of people, is a holy shrine, and for Olga's parents, this was no different. They would visit frequently to show their respect for their daughter and to be close to her in her final resting place. On the 7th of May 2003, Olga's father erected a metal fence around the grave and started painting it. The next day, when they returned to finish painting the fence, they felt somebody had been there because a wreath had been moved. And this is maybe when Anatoly took the body. The torment began here, and it would last for almost 9 years. Moskvin would start leaving letters and notes at the grave, which he would sign at the end of each one of them as D.A. This would stand for Dobry Angel, which translated means good or kind angel. So this is how Moskvin viewed himself, and he felt that he was being kind by digging these children's bodies up and mummifying them and taking them back to his parents' apartment. Anatoly also developed a pet name for Olga, and on the letters that he would leave at their grave would call her Little Lady. That's sick. It's harrowing. The parents have lost their child, but now they're suffering this torment. So Natalia said that both her and her husband would shiver in fear each time they went to the grave, not knowing what to expect, and what sick anonymous note signed by Kind Angel would be addressed to her daughter called the Little Lady. So this must have been truly awful for the parents, and I can't begin to even imagine what they're going through. Not only the grief, not only that their daughter was murdered and they didn't receive her body for 5 months, but now they're reliving this all of the time. One day, Anatoly left a note advising that if a great monument is not erected, which the little lady deserves, that we will dig her out. So I mean, I don't know if he's used the word we because he was working with anybody else. It doesn't seem that he was. It does seem that it was a lone activity. Or maybe because he struggled himself. He was always socially awkward. He was always alone and he didn't want to be. So he might have pluralized it to feel like he's with other people, to feel like he's got a common purpose. Or maybe it was just more threatening for the parents to feel like there's a group of people doing this to their daughter's grave. So in June 2003, a headstone was erected by Natalia and her husband. Anatoly then started writing in pen on the stone before he smashed it up with an axe, as he didn't feel like it was good enough. The police were informed about what was happening to Olga's grave, and they were appalled but advised there was little they could do. If Natalia and her husband found out who was doing this, they stated they could do whatever they wanted to him and they wouldn't object, as he's behaving like a barbarian. For nearly 9 years, notes were left. Every public holiday a note was left. On New Year's Day, a soft toy would be left, often taken from other graves. Anatoly had also carefully remembered school dates, graduation dates, and would add little notes congratulating Olga on another successful year at school, on another graduation, when she was ready to start her next year group. So her parents were really reliving this all the time. Also as well, the fact that he was taking teddies off other graves to put on this one, so he was just causing so much upset and psychological torture for so many people in these cemeteries who were just trying to grieve for their children. This non-stop psychological torture for Olga's parents was enough to drive them apart. They separated as Natalia needed to move away. She could no longer cope with the strain, and understandably so. She was reliving this nightmare every single day. There is some good news. I know you can't really call it good news, but Natalia and her husband did get back together eventually. They did have another child as well, so they've got a little boy, and this is said to have restored their faith in life. So although Olga was never with them again, and they did suffer so much, they have been able to move on with their lives a little bit. So that obviously is good to hear. Obviously they'll never recover from what's happened, but at least it feels like they do have a second chance. So Anatoly was never sent to prison for his crimes. He was classed as mentally ill, so he would not be able to stand trial. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital in 2011, whereby he was sentenced to 5 years of treatment for his paranoid schizophrenia that he was diagnosed with. So that was 2011. So what's happening to Anatoly today? That 5 years passed in 2016, but I can inform you that he's still in the same psychiatric hospital, but he is appealing for his release. He wants to leave the hospital so he can move in with his new girlfriend and care for his elderly mum. This is a strange situation that you tend to find with a lot of crimes and a lot of criminals. They do often find girlfriends and wives. Whilst they're there, they'll get like a pen pal. So I mean that itself's a fascinating thing, really. Like that somebody on the outside world who maybe hasn't committed any crimes can be aware of what somebody has done. So somebody will know, the girlfriend he's now got will know that he's took up 26 bodies, and I can't understand what goes on in somebody's head to then want to have a relationship with him knowing that he's done this. So that's obviously a worrying thing as well. So he is appealing for his release at the moment. The 5 years have passed. In late 2020, Anatoly attended a custody hearing as part of his appeal to be released. He's been offered the chance to apologise to the parents and families of the 26 victims, however he refuses to. Moskvin is quoted as saying at the custody hearing, "These girls are girls, they are no parents in my view, I don't know any of them, and besides they buried their daughters, and this is where I believe their rights over them finished, so no, I will not apologise." One of the Russian medical commissions has already recommended his release, indicating that his schizophrenia has been treated successfully. This, however, was overturned by the judge in late 2020. The judge renewed his detention in the psychiatric facility for a further 6 months. This also now will have expired, and we don't have any further updates yet. It is likely that Moskvin is waiting for another hearing to see if he can be released back into the community. The Daily Mail has reached out to Olga's mother, we've previously spoke about, and she's still suffering almost 20 years later. Although she's since had her son and she's got back with her husband, her daughter was reburied again in 2012, but to this day she's still in an unmarked grave. Such is the obsession with Moskvin with his little girl. They have never wanted to erect another gravestone in case when he's released he goes looking for her again. She wants to be reassured that he'll be locked up forever, and she'd be happy for him to be in the psychiatric facility for the rest of his days. The fact that this has been going on 20 years and he still shows no remorse, I feel so sorry for the parents of the victims. Anatoly's mother, now 77, she's come out and said that she knew of the dolls but never suspected they were dead bodies and just assumed it was a hobby of her son's. She also feels that the court system has treated him unfairly and said they were biased against him as he was not married. he was unable to find regular paid work and wasn't functioning regularly in society. This, however, is clearly not the case. I mean, he dug up the remains of 26 young girls. He tormented the parents for 9 years by leaving notes on their gravestones, desecrating them. In the case of Olga's, he smashed the gravestone up. This is why he was locked away. It's nothing to do with any social struggles or lack of work with no regular income or marriage. So to conclude with the case, it's clear that Anatoly Moskvin is seriously mentally ill. Like he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in 2011. Although he was only charged with 5 years, he's still there 10 years on. One institution did say that he'd been successfully treated. However, this was overturned by the judge, and in his clear statements recently, he still shows no remorse. He still feels like he's done nothing wrong. I mean, it's clear that if he does ever get out, he does need to be heavily supervised, because he left the chilling message with the police that don't dig the girls too deep, because I will be coming back for them. The likelihood of him reoffending, if he feels like he's done nothing wrong and he's in fact helping these people, helping these girls, then it is really worrying. Also, there's the worry as well as reoffending, what if the offending gets worse? I mean, although it's deeply horrific what he has been doing, he stated a number of times that he was doing this because he wanted to preserve the girls. What if he wants somebody fresher? What if he decided to kill somebody who was living, so he could turn them into a doll as soon as they died, and they would be forever locked in this eternal beauty as he's seen it. So it's what it is, a strange case. Like the majority of cases that we do look at and we have got in the pipeline are around people who have killed people. So this is a slightly different one, but I just found it amazing to research. It was harrowing, it was upsetting. It's clear that Anatoly suffered deeply in childhood. He had a number of different experiences which shaped his future life. Not that I'm providing any excuses for him. The fact that he suffered the traumatic rape when he was 7 years old, that is something that I can't imagine the pain and suffering he went through at such a young age. And to keep that close to his chest for over 40 years, it obviously played an impact in his childhood. It made him withdrawn, it isolated him. There was a time when he was 12 years old when he no longer wanted to be isolated. He'd seen an opportunity whereby he could be accepted by his classmates, so he could integrate, he could fit in, when he was doing the initiative by the Russian government with the recycling. And at that point he was dragged into a funeral procession and forced to kiss the body of an 11-year-old dead girl. There was a posthumous marriage. What happened on the back of that? Following that, he had numerous nightmares that lasted for a year, and it was all about black magic and visiting Natasha, who he'd maybe been intertwined with. He became obsessed with pagan rituals, with Celtology, with lots of other dark occultist practices. So it obviously shaped his future, and he then felt more comfortable with life beyond the grave than he did with living people. So there's lots of factors in place, but it is clear that Anatoly hasn't recovered. He shows no remorse for the poor victims' families who are still being tormented today, who still daren't bury their children in marked graves in case he goes back for them if he's let out. So yeah, it's a very, very interesting case. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you stayed to the end. Anybody who did, if you could like, subscribe, share this. We're going to be doing one case per week, and if you have any suggestions, please leave a comment and we'll have a look at them as well. Thank you very much. Take care. Goodbye.